every letter the Apostle Paul wrote, explained in order. He sits in a dimly lit room in Rome, the kind of room that holds silence like a weight. The walls are plain, worn down by time, indifferent to the lives that have passed through them. A single narrow window lets in a thin blade of light that cuts across the stone floor. Dust drifts through it slowly, like time itself has slowed to watch this moment. A chain runs from his wrist to the arm of a Roman soldier standing nearby, bored, half aware, yet unknowingly tethered to history. The man does not look like someone who would change the world. There is no crown on his head, no crowd waiting outside his door, no scrolls lined up bearing his name in gold. Just a piece of papyrus, a reed pen, and a heart that refuses to stay silent. He leans forward, steadying the page with one hand. The chain shifts slightly, metal scraping softly against stone. The soldier glances down for a moment, then looks away again. To him, this is just another prisoner. Another assignment. Another long shift. But the man writing knows something the soldier does not. These words will travel farther than any army Rome has ever sent. He begins to write. Not for fame, not for recognition, not even for survival. He writes because somewhere, far beyond these walls, there are people he cannot forget. People who are confused. People who are arguing. People who are losing their way. And he cannot reach them with his voice anymore. So he reaches them with ink. The letters are not polished. They are not rehearsed. They are urgent, raw, alive. They carry frustration, tenderness, correction, and something deeper than all of it. Conviction. He writes like a father speaking to children who are slipping, like a man who has seen something so real, so undeniable, that he cannot let others walk away from it. Outside, Rome moves on as it always does. Merchants shout in the streets. Chariots roll across stone roads. Soldiers march in formation. The empire breathes, unaware that within one quiet room, a different kind of power is being released. Not the kind that conquers cities. The kind that changes hearts. The man pauses for a moment, lifting the pen. His eyes drift. Not to the room, not to the guard, but somewhere far away. Across land and sea. To faces he remembers clearly. Faces from Galatia. That's where it began. Not the beginning of his life, but the beginning of this fire that now refuses to die. Galatia wasn't a single city. It was a region, scattered towns connected by rough roads and shared struggles, places where life was hard, where survival came before philosophy, where people didn't have time for ideas that didn't matter. And yet, when he arrived, carrying nothing but a message, something happened. People listened. At first, cautiously, then curiously, then desperately, because what he spoke about wasn't just another idea. It was freedom. And freedom, when heard by those who have lived without it, does something powerful. It awakens something. He remembers the roads he walked. Dust rising with every step. The sun pressing down relentlessly. The nights where sleep came in fragments, if at all. The moments where he questioned everything. His strength, his path, even his survival. And still, he kept going. City after city, face after face. Until one day in a place called Lystra everything changed. The crowd turned. It didn't happen slowly. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was sudden, violent, explosive. One moment he was speaking. The next, stones were flying. They didn't stop. They didn't hesitate. The same voices that had listened now shouted. The same eyes that had watched now burned with something darker. The first stone hit hard, the second harder. Then they came faster than he could process. Blow after blow, pain breaking through every layer of his body. Until he fell. The world tilted, sound blurred, light fractured. And then nothing. They dragged his body outside the city, left him there, unmoving, broken. Certain he was dead. The crowd dispersed. The dust settled. The noise faded. Silence returned. But not for long, because slowly something shifted a breath. Barely noticeable. Then another. His chest rose again. Eyes opened, heavy, unfocused, but alive. He should have stayed down. Everything in logic said he should not get up again, but he did. Slowly. Painfully. Unbelievably. He stood. And instead of running away, he went back. Back into the same city. Back to the same people. Back to the place that nearly ended him. Because whatever he carried was stronger than fear. Stronger than pain. Stronger than survival itself. And that is what he's thinking about now, in this Roman room, as the pen touches the page again. Because those same people, the ones he almost died for, are slipping. Not because they stopped believing, but because something else has crept in. Something subtle. Something dangerous. Voices have come after him, other teachers. Other messages. They didn't deny everything. They didn't attack openly. They added, Just a little, just enough, they told the people. What you've received is good, but it's not complete. And that's all it takes. Not a complete lie. Just a small addition to the truth. Because once you add to something that was meant to be whole, you break it. And now the people who once stood in freedom are slowly stepping back into chains, not physical chains like his, but something heavier, something harder to see, expectation, pressure, the weight of trying to earn what was never meant to be earned. His grip tightens on the pen. This letter will not be soft. It cannot be. Because what's at stake is too important. He doesn't begin with greetings. He doesn't warm the tone. He goes straight to it. Direct, sharp, unfiltered. Because sometimes love doesn't whisper. Sometimes it confronts. Sometimes it shakes. Sometimes it refuses to stay quiet while something important is being lost. He writes quickly now, the words almost pulling themselves out of him, every line carrying urgency, every sentence cutting through confusion. This is not a casual letter. This is a line being drawn, because what he saw in Galatia, what he nearly died for, was not meant to be replaced, not meant to be modified, not meant to be diluted. He knows something most people don't. The moment you turn freedom into something you have to earn, it stops being freedom and becomes something else entirely, something heavier, something endless, something that will never satisfy, and he cannot let them go back to that. Not after everything, not after the road, not after the stones, not after the moment he stood back up when he should have stayed down. The soldier shifts beside him again, adjusting his stance. Still unaware, still disconnected, still thinking this is just another man writing another letter. But history is being written in this silence. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, line by line, word by word. The man pauses again, breathing slowly. The room feels smaller now, or maybe the weight of the moment feels larger, because he knows this is just the beginning. More letters will come, more struggles, more cities, more nights like this, more chains, more moments where everything could end. But for now, there is only this page, this message, this urgency. He lowers the pen again and continues writing. The ink is still fresh when he sets the first sheet aside. It hasn't dried yet, but he doesn't wait. There's no pause to admire what's been written, no moment of reflection to soften the weight of it. The urgency inside him doesn't allow that kind of stillness. He reaches for another piece of papyrus, the rough texture familiar beneath his fingers, and continues. Because Galatia is not the only place on his mind. There are other faces now, other cities, other voices echoing back to him from memory. And one of them rises clearer than the rest. Thessalonica, a city alive with movement, trade ships docking along its edges, markets filled with noise and motion, people passing through from every direction, carrying stories, goods and beliefs from across the empire. It was the kind of place where ideas spread quickly, and just as quickly, they were challenged. He remembers stepping into that city with the same message, not knowing how it would be received, not knowing how long he would be allowed to stay. But he spoke anyway. 3 weeks. That's all he had. 3 Sabbaths in a synagogue, opening the scriptures, reasoning, explaining, trying to make them see what he had seen. Some believed. Not all. But enough. Enough for something to begin. Enough for a small group to form. People who felt something shift inside them, something they couldn't ignore. And just like in Lystra, it didn't stay peaceful for long. Opposition came quickly. It always did. Jealousy stirred. Voices rose. A crowd gathered again. But this time not to listen, to accuse, to drag, to shout. He remembers the night he had to leave. Not by choice. Not because the work was finished. But because staying would have meant destruction. Not just for him, but for those who had believed. So he slipped away in the dark, quietly, urgently, leaving behind something fragile. A group of people barely rooted, barely steady, barely prepared for what was coming next. That memory still sits heavy in his chest, because leaving them felt wrong. It felt unfinished, like abandoning something before it could stand on its own. And for a long time after, that thought didn't leave him, even when he moved south, even when he reached Athens, even when he stood in Corinth. Their faces followed him, their questions, their uncertainty, their fear. He couldn't go back. But he couldn't ignore it either, so he sent someone, Timothy, young but steady, faithful, someone he trusted. Go, he told him, find them, see how they're holding up. And then he waited, days stretched. Then weeks, every moment filled with the same question. Did they hold on? Or did everything fall apart after he left? because he had seen it happen before. People believe quickly, and then drift just as fast when pressure rises, when doubt creeps in, when fear whispers louder than conviction, and in a city like Thessalonica, pressure didn't whisper, it shouted. Finally, Timothy returned, and the news was better than he expected. They were still standing, not perfect, not without questions, but standing. Their faith hadn't collapsed. It had grown, even under pressure. Even without him there to guide them. Something had taken root. Something real. He remembers the feeling when he heard it: relief. Deep, overwhelming relief. The kind that loosens something tight in your chest that you didn't even realize was there. And in that moment, he sat down and wrote again. But this letter was different. Not sharp like Galatians. Not filled with confrontation. This one carried warmth, affection, gratitude. The kind of tone that comes when you realize something you feared losing is still alive. He wrote to them like someone speaking to family. Not correcting. Not rebuking, but encouraging. Reminding them of what they had already become. Reminding them that what they held on to mattered. That their faith, in the middle of a loud, chaotic city, had not gone unnoticed. But even in that encouragement, there was something else. A question that had been growing among them. A fear that had quietly taken hold. Because while he was gone, something happened. People died, not in peace, not in comfort, but in uncertainty, and the ones left behind didn't know what to do with it. They had believed something powerful, something about hope, about the future, about what was coming. But now they were asking, what about those who are gone? Did they miss it? Are they lost? Did we misunderstand everything? And that fear, it changes things, because when hope becomes unclear, everything begins to feel unstable. So he writes, carefully, not rushing this part, because this isn't about correction, this is about comfort, real comfort. The kind that doesn't ignore pain but speaks into it. He tells them that those who have died are not forgotten, not left behind, not separated from what's coming. If anything, they are closer. Closer than those still waiting. He writes in a way that lifts the weight off their fear, not by removing loss, but by reframing it, by showing them that what they're afraid of is not what they think it is. That death is not the end of the story, that what comes next includes them, fully, completely, nothing missed, nothing lost. And you can almost feel the shift in the letter as he writes it. The tension easing, the heaviness lifting, because this isn't just information, it's reassurance, it's hope being restored. But time passes, and something unexpected happens. The message gets misunderstood, not twisted completely, but pushed too far, because now some of them begin to think, if what's coming is so near, if everything is about to change, then why keep living like this? Why work? Why plan? Why build anything if the end feels so close? So they stop. Not all of them, but enough to cause a problem, enough to shift the balance of the community, because now some are waiting instead of living, expecting instead of contributing. And once again, he picks up the pen. This time, the tone changes slightly, still caring, still connected, but firmer, more direct. Because hope is powerful, but when misunderstood, it can become an excuse. And he won't let that happen. He tells them plainly. Waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. Belief doesn't remove responsibility. Faith isn't passive, it's active. It moves. It builds. It continues forward even while looking ahead. He doesn't crush their hope. He refines it. Brings it back into balance. Because truth, when it's real, doesn't pull you out of life. It anchors you deeper into it. The room in Rome feels quiet again. The memory fades slightly as he lifts his eyes. The soldier is still there, unchanged, unmoved, still unaware of the weight of what's happening inches away from him. 2 letters now. 2 different cities. 2 different struggles, but the same thread running through both. Something is growing, not perfectly, not without resistance, but growing. And he knows there are more. More cities, more stories. More problems that haven't even surfaced yet. He shifts slightly, the chain pulling again at his wrist. A small reminder of where he is, of what this moment is. But even here, even like this, the work continues. Because distance doesn't stop it. Chains don't stop it. Time doesn't stop it. He reaches for another sheet. And as he does, another city rises in his mind. Louder, messier, more complicated than the rest. Corinth. And this one will not be easy. Corinth doesn't come into his mind quietly. It never does. It arrives loud, crowded, restless, like the city itself. A place that never really sleeps, never really slows down, always pulling people in from every direction. Trade routes crossing, ships docking, voices overlapping in markets that stretch for miles, money flowing, ideas colliding, desires unchecked. If Thessalonica was pressure, Corinth was chaos. He remembers the first time he walked its streets. The noise hit him before anything else. Conversations layered on top of each other. Bargaining, arguing, laughing, shouting. The smell of the sea mixed with smoke and sweat, people moving quickly, each with their own purpose, their own agenda. It was a place where anything could happen, and usually did. He stayed there longer than most cities, 18 months. A year and a half of building something from nothing, working during the day, hands rough from labor, stitching tents to survive. Speaking at night, pouring everything he had into anyone willing to listen. Slowly something formed, a group, not perfect, not clean, not polished, but real. People from different backgrounds, different histories, different habits. Coming together around something they didn't fully understand yet, but couldn't walk away from, and for a while it held. But Corinth was never the kind of place that stays steady for long. After he left, things didn't just drift. They fractured. He had seen division before. But this was something else. He can almost hear it now. The arguments, sharp, constant, relentless. Voices claiming allegiance to different leaders. I follow him. I follow someone else. I know the truth. No, you don't. Small disagreements turning into deep fractures. Not about survival, not about external pressure, but about pride, identity, position. And the more he thinks about it, the tighter his grip becomes on the pen. Because this kind of division, it doesn't come from outside. It grows from within, and it spreads fast. But that wasn't even the worst of it. There were things happening there. Things he never expected to hear about from people who once stood together. Situations that should have been confronted, ignored. Behavior that should have been corrected, accepted. Even defended. He had heard stories before, but these reports, they didn't feel distant. They felt personal. Because he knew them. He had been there. He had looked into their eyes. He had seen the moment something changed in them. And now, it felt like that moment was being buried under everything else. The room in Rome feels heavier as he remembers, because this letter, this one carries weight. Not just urgency, not just correction, but disappointment. Not the kind that gives up, but the kind that refuses to pretend everything is fine when it isn't. He lowers the pen. Starts writing. This time, he doesn't rush, because there is too much to address. Too much to untangle. The divisions come first. Because if the foundation cracks, nothing else holds. He doesn't take sides. He doesn't elevate one group over another. He cuts through it entirely. Reminds them that what they're arguing over was never meant to divide them, that the message they received was never about personalities, never about choosing sides. But they've turned it into that anyway, and once that happens, everything becomes about self, not truth, not unity, self. He writes firmly, directly, not to shame them, but to wake them up, because division like this doesn't fix itself, it deepens. Then he moves to the next issue, and this one is harder. Because it's not just disagreement, it's behavior. Actions that cross lines so clearly that even the world around them would question it. And yet, they aren't confronting it. They're tolerating it, even taking pride in their ability to accept everything without resistance. But there's a difference between grace and ignoring what destroys. He knows that, and now they need to know it too, so he writes again, not softly, not vaguely, clearly. Because some things cannot be left in gray areas. Some things need light, even if that light is uncomfortable. The letter grows longer, issue after issue, problem after problem. It would be easier to stop, to say less, to avoid the tension, but he doesn't. Because avoiding it would mean letting it continue. And that he refuses to do. The soldier shifts again beside him, the faint clink of chain echoing lightly in the room. Still nothing more than background noise to him. Still unaware that this letter will outlive everything he knows, that the words being written now will travel further than any road he has walked. Paul pauses, just for a moment, because in the middle of all this correction, all this tension, there's something else, something deeper, something they've lost sight of, and if he doesn't bring it back, nothing else will matter. He leans forward again, slows down, because this part needs to be said differently. Not with urgency, but with clarity. He begins to write about something they think they understand, but clearly don't. Love. Not the word they throw around casually, not the version shaped by emotion or convenience, but something stronger, something quieter, something that doesn't need attention, but holds everything together. He writes carefully, line by line, describing it, what it looks like, how it acts, what it refuses to become. It doesn't push itself forward. It doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't collapse under pressure. It stays. It endures. It chooses patience over reaction, truth over comfort. And as the words form, the tone of the letter shifts, not away from correction, but deeper than it. Because now he's not just telling them what's wrong, he's showing them what's missing. Because without this, everything else they're doing means nothing. Not their words, not their actions, not even their efforts. It all becomes noise, empty, loud but hollow. He knows this part matters. Because it cuts through everything else. It strips away the distractions, the arguments, the pride, and leaves only one question behind. What are they actually becoming? He lets the pen rest for a second, breath steady, eyes focused. Because even after this, there's more. Another question they've been asking. Another uncertainty that's been growing. This one not about behavior, not about division, but about something deeper, something final, death. And what comes after? It's not the same fear as Thessalonica, not confusion about those who have already died, but doubt. Questions about whether any of it is real, whether what they believe actually holds, or if it's just hope without substance. He feels the weight of that, because if that doubt takes root, everything collapses. So he writes again, carefully building the answer, not emotionally, not loosely, step by step, because this isn't just about comfort, it's about foundation. He points back to what happened, to what was seen, to what cannot be ignored. Not just belief, but reality. Because if that moment didn't happen, if it wasn't real, then none of this stands. But if it did, then everything changes. Everything. The room feels still again. The kind of stillness that follows something heavy, something important. He sets the pen down for a moment, looking at what's been written so far. Not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with awareness. Because this letter isn't easy. It's not gentle. It's not comfortable. But it's necessary. Because sometimes, what people need most is not affirmation, but truth, even when it's hard, even when it confronts. Even when it forces change, he exhales slowly, reaches for the next sheet. Because this story isn't finished yet. Corinth still has more to say, and so does he. The room grows quieter as the night deepens, but his thoughts do not slow. Corinth is not finished with him yet, it lingers. Not just as a place, but as a weight. Because that first letter, it didn't solve everything. It never does. Words can confront, correct, expose. But they don't instantly heal what's been broken over time. And Corinth had been breaking for a while. He remembers going back, not physically at first, but in thought, in concern, in restless nights where sleep refused to come because something didn't feel right. Then eventually, he did return. And what happened there, it stayed with him. Not as a victory, but as a wound. Something had shifted in the people. Not all of them, but enough to make his presence feel different, less welcomed, less trusted. There was a moment, he can still see it clearly, where everything turned. A confrontation, public, sharp. Not just disagreement, but humiliation. And he didn't fight back, didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself the way he could have. He took it, not because he had no answer, but because sometimes responding in that moment would only deepen the damage. So he left, not in anger, not in defeat, but in pain. The kind that doesn't show on the surface immediately. The kind that sits quietly and grows heavier over time. Back in the Roman room, his hand tightens slightly as he remembers. Because that moment, it changed something. Not in his mission, not in what he believed, but in how deeply he felt the cost of it. People think the hardest part is the opposition from outside. The threats, the violence, the chains. But sometimes, the deeper pain comes from inside. From people you invested in, people you trusted, people you thought understood. Turning, questioning, walking away. He didn't write immediately after that visit. Not right away. Because some things need time. Time to settle. Time to be seen clearly. Time to decide how to respond without letting emotion take control. But eventually, he wrote again. A letter filled with weight. Not anger, but something close to it. Grief, disappointment, honesty that didn't hide behind soft words. That letter didn't survive, at least not in the form we have now, but its impact did, because something shifted after it was received. Some of them came back, not all, but enough. Enough to change the tone of what came next. And now, sitting in this room, chained older, carrying more than he did back then, he writes again. This time, the letter feels different. Still honest, still direct, but deeper, more open, less guarded. Because now it's not just about correcting behavior. It's about revealing something personal, something they haven't fully seen before. He doesn't defend himself the way people expect. He doesn't list achievements. He doesn't remind them of what he's done. He does something else, something unexpected. He begins to talk about weakness. Not hiding it, not minimizing it, but bringing it forward, clearly, because the accusations against him, they weren't about truth. They were about perception. They say you're not impressive. They say your presence is weak. They say your words carry more weight than you do. He's heard it, every version of it, and instead of pushing back, he leans into something deeper. Because the truth is, he knows what he looks like. He knows what people expect, and he knows he doesn't fit that image. But what they see as weakness is not what defines him. So he writes about what he's been through. Not to impress them, not to prove anything, but to show them something real. The beatings, the moments where his body couldn't take more but somehow did. The nights without sleep, the hunger, the exhaustion that goes beyond physical and settles into the soul, the danger that never fully leaves. Not in cities, not on roads, not even among people who claim to believe the same things. He lists it all, not dramatically, not exaggerated, just truth, because that is his reality, and if they want to measure something, let them measure that. But even that isn't the center. There's something else, something he's carried quietly for a long time, something he rarely speaks about. But now, he brings it forward, not fully explained, not detailed, but present, a struggle, persistent, unrelenting, something that doesn't go away, something that stays, no matter how much he asks for it to leave. He had asked, more than once, more than twice, not casually, not lightly, but seriously, fully, and the answer was not what he expected, not removal, not relief, but something else, something that didn't change the situation, but changed how he carried it. And that's what he writes about now. Because that answer, it reshaped everything. It shifted his understanding of strength, of purpose, of what it means to keep going when something doesn't get fixed. He doesn't present it as easy. He doesn't pretend it doesn't hurt. But he makes something clear. What he didn't lose was not less than what he asked for. It was greater, because it allowed him to continue, to endure, to move forward, even with the weight still there. And in that, there is something powerful, something that doesn't come from comfort, but from persistence, the kind that doesn't break under pressure, but adapts, grows, deepens. The room feels still again, but not empty, full of everything that's been written, everything that's been remembered, everything that's been carried across years, across cities, across moments that could have ended it all. He sets the pen down briefly, not finished, but pausing. Because Corinth is no longer just a place of correction. It has become something else. A place where he revealed more of himself than he had before, where the message wasn't just spoken, but lived out in a way they couldn't ignore. And now, that chapter begins to close. Not completely, but enough, because ahead of him, there's something different, not chaos, not fragmentation, but something larger, more structured, more deliberate, a place he hasn't fully stepped into yet, but has been thinking about for a long time. Rome, not this room, not this moment, but the city itself, the center, the place where everything connects. And before he ever arrived here in chains, before this room, before this silence, he had already written to them. A different kind of letter, not reactive, not driven by crisis, but built carefully, layer by layer, thought by thought, a message that didn't just address a problem, but laid out something complete. Something foundational, something that would outlast everything else. He reaches for another sheet, because that letter is next. A man sits in a dim, borrowed room in the heart of Rome, his wrist bound to a Roman guard, iron resting against skin, and he reaches for a pen, not to craft a masterpiece for scholars or compose a formal theological volume, but to write to people he knows by name, people he cares about deeply, people who are confused, divided, struggling to hold on, and those simple, urgent letters, scratched onto fragile papyrus and carried by hand across long Roman roads and unpredictable sea routes, would eventually become the most powerful and widely read collection of personal correspondence the world has ever known. 13 letters attributed in the New Testament to a single man, the Apostle Paul, written across roughly 15 years between about AD 49 and AD 67. And here is something that often goes unnoticed. They are not arranged in your Bible in the order they were written. Instead, they are placed by size, from the longest to the shortest, beginning with Romans and ending with Philemon, which would be like organizing someone's entire life story by email length instead of timeline, completely losing the emotional and historical progression. But when you place them back into their actual chronological sequence, something remarkable begins to take shape. You no longer see isolated teachings. You begin to watch a life unfold. You follow a man as he defends a message still in its infancy. You witness him establishing communities of faith in cities filled with chaos and moral confusion. You sit beside him in moments of suffering and confinement. You feel the sting of betrayal as trusted companions drift away. And eventually you stand beside him in the shadow of a cold Roman cell as he writes what he knows may be his final words, asking for a simple cloak to keep warm as winter approaches. And so what we are doing here is stepping into that journey, walking letter by letter in the order they were most likely written, uncovering what each message meant in its original moment and why it continues to speak with such force even now. And it all begins with a letter that does not ease in gently but erupts with urgency. The letter to the Galatians, written somewhere around AD 48 or 49. And to understand the intensity behind it, you have to understand the man behind the pen. This is not a neutral observer, but someone who once actively hunted followers of Jesus, who stood approvingly as Stephen was executed in Acts chapter 7, who believed he was serving God by destroying the very movement he would later give his life to defend, until a moment on the road to Damascus when everything changed, when the one he opposed confronted him directly, turning his entire identity upside down. And now that same man writes passionately to protect the truth he once tried to erase, having just returned from his first missionary journey through the region of Galatia, in what is now central Turkey, preaching in cities like Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, where in Lystra he was stoned by a crowd and left for dead outside the city, yet rose again and continued preaching, establishing small communities of believers before returning to Antioch in Syria, only to hear troubling news that other teachers had entered those new churches insisting that faith in Jesus alone was not sufficient, that Gentile believers must also adopt Jewish customs, including circumcision, essentially adding conditions to grace. And for Paul this was not a minor disagreement, but a direct threat to the core of the gospel. And so he writes what becomes the most intense and confrontational letter in the New Testament, skipping the usual warm greetings and moving straight into correction, expressing astonishment that they are turning so quickly to a distorted version of the message, emphasizing that salvation is not earned through adherence to law but received through faith in Christ, explaining that justification means being declared righteous by God, not because of personal achievement, but because of what Christ has accomplished, reaching back even to Abraham to show that righteousness has always been based on belief rather than ritual, describing the law as a temporary guide pointing toward Christ, like training wheels that serve a purpose for a time but are no longer needed once balance is found, and then making a bold declaration that in Christ the divisions that once defined people no longer determine their standing before God, drawing a clear line between freedom and bondage, between grace and performance, and from there the story shifts geographically and emotionally as Paul travels into Greece during his second missionary journey, arriving in Thessalonica around AD 50 or 51, a major port city where he preaches for only a short time before opposition forces him to leave suddenly, leaving behind a group of new believers facing uncertainty and pressure. And from a distance, concerned for their well-being, he sends Timothy to check on them, and when good news returns, he writes what we now call 1 Thessalonians, a letter filled with affection and encouragement, reflecting the heart of a spiritual father who genuinely loves the people he is writing to, yet addressing a deep concern among them, as some members of their community had died and others feared they would miss the return of Christ, leading Paul to reassure them that those who have died are not forgotten but will rise first, offering not abstract doctrine but real comfort in the face of grief. grounding hope in the promise of resurrection, and shortly afterward writing a second letter to correct misunderstandings that had gone in the opposite direction, where some believers had become idle, abandoning responsibility under the assumption that the end was imminent, prompting Paul to remind them that faith does not remove the call to live responsibly, but strengthens it, emphasizing that expectation of the future should lead to purposeful living rather than passivity. And from there the focus turns to Corinth, one of the most complex and troubled communities Paul encountered, a wealthy and culturally diverse city known for moral instability, where he had spent significant time building a church that quickly became divided after his departure, leading to the writing of 1 Corinthians around AD 53 to 56, a letter addressing a wide range of issues including division, immorality, legal disputes among believers, misuse of spiritual gifts, and disorder in communal worship. Yet in the midst of correction, Paul pauses to articulate one of the most profound descriptions of love ever written, emphasizing that without love, even the most impressive spiritual abilities and sacrifices amount to nothing, reframing their conflicts through the lens of humility and selflessness. And later in the same letter, presenting a detailed defense of the resurrection, affirming it as central to the faith rather than optional, and then following up with 2 Corinthians after a painful personal visit and ongoing tension with critics who questioned his authority, where instead of defending himself through accomplishments he shares his hardships, listing suffering rather than success as his credentials, revealing vulnerability rather than strength, and speaking openly about a persistent struggle he describes as a thorn in the flesh, something he asked God multiple times to remove, but instead received the answer that grace would be sufficient. Learning that strength is often revealed through weakness rather than removed from it, and then eventually turning his attention toward Rome, a city he had not yet visited but longed to reach, writing what becomes his most structured and comprehensive explanation of the gospel around AD 57, carefully building an argument from the reality of universal human failure to the provision of grace through Christ, explaining justification, peace with God, freedom from sin's control, the internal struggle believers experience, and the assurance that nothing can separate them from God's love, while also addressing questions about Israel's place in God's plan and describing what a transformed life looks like in practical terms, urging believers to offer themselves fully in response to mercy, and after all of this writing eventually arriving in Rome, not as a free traveler but as a prisoner, yet continuing to teach and write from a rented house where he is allowed visitors, producing letters now known as the prison epistles, including Ephesians, which explores God's overarching plan and identity of believers, Philippians, which emphasizes joy despite hardship, Colossians, which centers on the supremacy of Christ over all things, and Philemon, a short but deeply personal appeal regarding a runaway slave, demonstrating the practical outworking of forgiveness and reconciliation, and after this period of confinement, likely experiencing a release and continuing his travels, writing letters to individuals like Timothy and Titus to guide them in leading communities, and maintaining sound teaching, before eventually being arrested again under harsher conditions during a time of persecution, leading to his final letter, 2 Timothy, written from a cold and isolated prison environment, where he reflects on his life, encourages perseverance, and expresses a sense of completion, not claiming perfection but faithfulness, asking for simple comforts and continued companionship, and according to tradition, eventually facing execution in Rome, bringing to a close a life marked not by ease, but by unwavering commitment. And when you step back and consider these 13 letters together, you see more than isolated teachings. You see the unfolding story of a man committed to a message that reshaped lives across cultures and generations, a message centered on grace, faith, and the transformative power of Christ, speaking into real struggles, real communities, and real human experiences. And even now, centuries later, those words continue to resonate, offering guidance, correction, comfort, and hope to anyone willing to listen. After everything that had already been written, after the journeys, the imprisonments, the confrontations, the quiet moments of encouragement, and the loud moments of correction, Paul's story does not slow down into comfort. It sharpens into something more personal, more focused, and more intimate than anything that came before. Because now he is no longer writing primarily to entire churches, filled with hundreds of people. He is writing to individuals, to young leaders who are standing in the middle of responsibility that feels heavier than they expected, and the tone shifts in a way that feels almost like a father sitting across from a son, speaking plainly, directly, without performance, without distance. Just truth that has been tested by time and pain and experience. And the first of these letters is what we now call 1 Timothy, written to a young man who had walked beside Paul through some of the most intense seasons of ministry. A man who had seen riots break out, who had traveled across cities and cultures, who had watched Paul suffer and continue, and yet now finds himself in a position where all of that preparation leads to one of the most difficult assignments he could receive: leading the church in Ephesus, a city known not just for its size but for its influence, a place where culture, religion, and commerce collided, where the Temple of Artemis stood as one of the wonders of the ancient world, drawing people from everywhere. And in the middle of that environment, the church is struggling, not with one single issue, but with many false teachings spreading confusion, leadership lacking structure, people arguing over ideas that lead nowhere, and Timothy is young, carrying responsibility that would overwhelm even seasoned leaders, and Paul writes to steady him, not with vague encouragement, but with clear instruction, explaining what leadership should look like, what kind of character matters, how to handle conflict, how to care for people in practical ways, how to guard the message from distortion. And yet in the middle of all of these instructions, Paul reveals something deeply personal, something that cuts through any sense of pride or distance. He describes himself not as someone who has arrived, but as someone who still sees his need for grace clearly, not in the past tense but in the present, as if to say that no amount of experience removes the need for humility. And that realization becomes the foundation for everything else, because leadership without humility becomes control, and knowledge without humility becomes arrogance. And Timothy needs to understand that the strength he is looking for does not come from appearing strong, but from staying grounded in the truth of who he is and who God is. And then Paul writes to Titus, another young leader placed in a different environment, but facing similar challenges, on the island of Crete, a place known for its rough reputation, where honesty was not valued and discipline was often lacking. And Paul does not soften the reality. He tells Titus directly that the environment is difficult, that the people can be challenging, that the work will not be easy, but instead of discouraging him, he gives him clarity, because clarity is what allows someone to move forward, even when the conditions are not ideal. And he lays out what healthy leadership looks like again, emphasizing integrity, self-control, consistency, not as abstract ideals, but as necessary foundations for building something that will last. And within that letter he also delivers one of the clearest summaries of the gospel, reminding that salvation is not earned by effort, but given through mercy. That transformation is not self-produced but comes through renewal, and that identity is not based on past mistakes, but on what has been given freely. And this becomes crucial for someone leading others, because you cannot guide people into freedom if you are still trying to earn your own. And then everything moves toward the final letter, the one that carries a weight different from all the others. Because now the setting has changed again, the time is different, the atmosphere is heavier, persecution has intensified, and Paul is no longer in a rented house with visitors coming and going. He is in a much darker place, a prison that feels less like confinement and more like abandonment, isolated, cold, with very few people left beside him. And this is where he writes 2 Timothy, not knowing if there will be another opportunity, not expecting release, but fully aware that the end of his life is approaching. And the tone of this letter is unlike anything else he has written, because it carries both urgency and peace at the same time. Urgency because he knows time is short, and peace because he knows the foundation he has built his life on is not uncertain. And he begins by reminding Timothy of something simple but powerful, the faith that has been passed down to him, not just through teaching but through family, through the example of those who came before him. Because in moments of pressure, people often forget where they came from, and remembering that foundation becomes a source of strength. And then he encourages him to stir up what has already been placed inside him, not to wait for something new, but to activate what is already there, emphasizing that fear is not the source of his calling, that what he has been given includes power, love, and a clear mind, not confusion, not hesitation. And this becomes critical because fear has a way of shrinking people into silence. And Paul knows that Timothy cannot afford to shrink back. And so he gives him one of the most direct instructions in the entire letter: to stay committed to the message, to speak it clearly whether it is welcomed or resisted, whether the timing feels right or not, because truth does not depend on convenience. And then Paul does something that shifts the entire tone again. He begins to speak about his own life in a way that feels like a closing chapter, not with regret, not with bitterness, but with a sense of completion, describing his life as something that has been poured out fully, like an offering with nothing held back. And he does not claim perfection. He does not say he succeeded in every moment. He does not pretend that every decision was flawless. Instead, he frames his life in terms of faithfulness, saying that he fought the fight, that he finished the race, that he held on to what mattered. And that distinction is important, because it separates the idea of success from the idea of completion, showing that what matters most is not how impressive something looks from the outside, but whether it was carried through to the end. And even in this moment, with everything he has experienced, he still asks for simple things: a cloak to stay warm, his books to continue learning. A request that feels almost ordinary, but carries depth when you realize the context. Because even at the edge of life, he is still thinking about growth, still valuing knowledge, still moving forward in the only way he can. And according to early historical accounts, his life ends not long after, executed in Rome during a time when following Christ carried real danger. And yet, when you step back and look at everything together, all 13 letters, all the places, all the seasons, you begin to see something that is easy to miss when reading them individually. You see consistency, not in circumstances, but in message. You see a man who began by defending a single truth and then spent the rest of his life exploring what that truth means in every possible situation, in relationships, in leadership, in suffering, in failure, in endurance, in everyday decisions. And what stands out most is not just what he taught, but how he lived. Because the message did not stay on paper. It moved through real experiences, through challenges that tested whether it was actually true. And the conclusion that forms from all of it is not complicated. It is direct, that the gospel is not something that waits for perfect conditions. It meets people exactly where they are. That suffering does not automatically mean something has gone wrong. Sometimes it is the place where strength becomes visible, and that finishing well is not about recognition but about staying faithful. And even now, long after those letters were first written and carried across ancient roads and seas, their impact continues, not because of the paper they were written on, but because of the truth they contain. A truth that does not fade with time, a truth that continues to speak into lives that are just as complex, just as uncertain, and just as in need of clarity as the ones they were first written to. And when you sit with all of it long enough, when you stop reading these letters as separate pieces and begin to see them as one continuous story, something shifts in the way you understand not just Paul's life but your own. Because what unfolds is not the story of a man who had everything figured out from the beginning, but of someone who was constantly being shaped, corrected, stretched, and refined through every season he walked through. And that changes the way you see progress. Because progress in this story does not look like perfection. It looks like persistence. It looks like getting back up after being knocked down. It looks like continuing forward, even when clarity is incomplete and conditions are far from ideal. And one of the clearest patterns that emerges is that every place Paul went came with resistance. Not occasionally, but consistently. And yet the resistance never became the reason to stop. It became the context in which the message proved its strength. And that alone challenges the assumption that difficulty is a sign that something is wrong. Because in Paul's life, difficulty was often the very environment where the most important work was happening, and that reframes how you interpret your own struggles. Because instead of asking why things are hard, you begin to ask what is being built through the difficulty. And that question leads somewhere deeper. Because throughout all 13 letters, there is a thread that never disappears, the idea that transformation is not instant. It is layered, it is gradual, it is something that unfolds over time, and that matters because we live in a mindset that expects immediate results, immediate clarity, immediate change. But nothing in Paul's journey supports that expectation. Everything about his life points to a process that takes time, that requires patience, that involves moments of doubt and frustration and growth that is not always visible in the moment. And when you look at how he writes to different people, you notice that he never gives the same answer in the same way twice, not because the truth changes, but because the application does. Because people are different, situations are different, and wisdom requires understanding what is needed in the moment. And that alone reveals something important. That truth is not meant to be repeated mechanically, it is meant to be lived intentionally. And that means paying attention, it means being present. It means recognizing that what worked in one season may not be what is required in another, and that flexibility does not weaken the message, it strengthens it, because it allows it to reach real situations instead of staying abstract. And then there is the way Paul handles relationships, which is something that becomes more noticeable the further you go. Because early on the focus is more on establishing truth, on correcting error, on defining what matters, but as time moves forward, the relational side becomes more visible, the weight of people, the impact of connection, the reality of disappointment when people leave, and the quiet strength of those who remain. And that adds another layer to the story, because it shows that no matter how strong the message is, it is always carried through imperfect relationships. And that means dealing with conflict, with misunderstanding, with moments where trust is broken. And yet the response is never to withdraw completely. It is to continue engaging, to continue investing, to continue building, even when the outcome is uncertain. And that takes a kind of endurance that is not often talked about, because it is easier to walk away than to stay committed when things become complicated. And yet commitment is exactly what defines the consistency of Paul's life, not because it was easy, but because it was chosen repeatedly. And that brings you to another realization, that purpose is not something you declare once and then simply live out without interruption. It is something you return to again and again, especially when circumstances try to pull you away from it. And you see that clearly in the way Paul continues writing, even when his freedom is gone, even when his influence seems limited, even when his physical condition is far from ideal, because his sense of purpose is not tied to his environment. It is anchored in something deeper. And that is what allows him to continue producing something meaningful, even from a place that looks restrictive from the outside. And that challenges the idea that you need perfect conditions to create something impactful, because some of the most powerful things in this entire story were written in confinement, in limitation, in seasons where most people would assume nothing significant could come out of it. And yet those were the moments that produced some of the most enduring messages. And that forces you to reconsider how you view your own limitations, because maybe they are not barriers in the way you think. Maybe they are shaping something that would not exist without them. And then there is the ending, which does not follow the pattern most people expect, because it is not dramatic in the way stories are often told. It is not filled with visible triumph or public recognition. It is quiet, it is simple, it is almost understated. And yet that simplicity carries more weight than a grand ending ever could, because it reflects something real, something grounded, something that is not dependent on external validation. And when Paul says that he has finished the race, that he has kept the faith, it does not feel like a performance. It feels like a conclusion that has been earned through consistency. And that is where everything comes together, because the real takeaway from all of this is not just what was written, it is how it was lived. It is the understanding that faithfulness is not measured by how visible something is, but by how consistently it is carried out over time. And that applies directly to anyone reading this now, because the same patterns are still relevant, the same questions still exist, the same challenges still appear in different forms, and the same need for clarity, for direction, for purpose is still present. And so when you look at these letters not just as historical documents, but as part of a larger story, you begin to see that they are not distant, they are not disconnected from your reality, they speak into it, not by giving you a perfect roadmap where every step is clearly defined, but by showing you what it looks like to move forward even when everything is not clear, to stay grounded even when everything around you is shifting, to continue building even when the results are not immediately visible, and to finish what you started not because it is easy, but because it matters. And that is what gives these letters their lasting impact, not just the words themselves, but the life behind them, a life that proves that consistency, endurance, and faithfulness over time can create something that outlives the moment it was written in, something that continues to speak long after the circumstances that produced it have passed. And that is what you are left with at the end. Not just information, but perspective, not just instruction, but a way of seeing your own journey differently, with more patience, more clarity, and a deeper understanding that what you are building now, even if it feels small, even if it feels unseen, has the potential to matter far beyond what you can currently see, as long as you keep going. And if you keep following that thread all the way through, if you let it settle instead of rushing past it, you begin to notice something even deeper, something that sits underneath every letter, every journey, every decision. And it is this quiet reality that nothing about this story was ever built on comfort. It was built on conviction, and there is a difference between the two that most people don't fully recognize, because comfort is easy to follow when things are going well, but conviction is what holds you steady when everything around you becomes uncertain, and that is exactly what you see in Paul's life from beginning to end. Not someone reacting emotionally to every situation, but someone anchored in something that does not move even when everything else does. And that kind of stability does not come from circumstances, it comes from clarity, from knowing what matters and refusing to compromise it, even when the cost is high. And once you see that clearly, it starts to challenge the way you approach your own life, because it forces you to ask whether the things you are building are based on comfort or conviction, whether your decisions are shaped by what is easy or by what is true. And that question is not always comfortable to answer, because conviction often leads you into places that require more from you than you initially expected. It demands consistency, discipline, patience, and sometimes even sacrifice, and yet that is exactly where the depth of this story comes from, not from avoiding difficulty but from walking through it with purpose. And another layer that becomes impossible to ignore is how Paul handles uncertainty. Because despite everything he experienced, there were still moments where outcomes were unclear, where the future was not fully visible, where plans changed, where expectations had to be adjusted, and yet uncertainty never paralyzed him, it never stopped him from moving forward. And that reveals something important. That clarity does not always mean knowing every step ahead. Sometimes it simply means knowing enough to take the next step, and trusting that the rest will unfold as you continue. And that is a completely different mindset from waiting until everything feels certain before acting. Because if Paul had waited for perfect clarity, most of what we have would never have been written. Most of the places he went would never have been reached. And that applies directly to how you approach your own decisions, because there are moments where you hesitate, where you wait for more certainty, more confirmation, more assurance. But sometimes what you actually need is not more information. It is the willingness to move forward with what you already know. And that leads into another pattern that runs consistently through everything. The idea that growth is not always visible in the moment, that many of the most important developments happen in seasons that feel hidden, unnoticed, even frustrating at times. Why? And yet those are often the seasons where the strongest foundations are being built. And you see that clearly in the way Paul writes from places of limitation. Because those moments did not look productive from the outside. They did not look like success in the way people usually define it. And yet they produced something that lasted far beyond anything visible at the time. And that completely reshapes how you view your own hidden seasons. Because instead of seeing them as wasted time, you begin to recognize them as preparation, as space where something is being formed that will eventually have impact. Even if you cannot see it yet. And then there is the way he deals with pressure. Because pressure shows up in different forms throughout the story. Sometimes it is external opposition, sometimes it is internal responsibility, sometimes it is relational tension, and in every case, the response is not avoidance. It is engagement. It is stepping into the situation rather than stepping away from it, and that requires a level of resilience that is built over time, not something that appears instantly. And that is another important detail. Resilience is not something you either have or don't have. It is something that develops through repeated experiences, through choosing to continue when it would be easier to stop. And that process is often uncomfortable. But it is also what creates the capacity to handle more in the future. And as you move closer to the end of the story, what stands out more than anything else is the absence of regret in Paul's words. Not because everything went perfectly, but because he stayed aligned with what he believed mattered most. And that alignment becomes the difference between a life that feels scattered and one that feels complete. Because completion is not about doing everything, it is about doing what you were meant to do and carrying it through to the end. And that is where the final perspective begins to settle in. Because when you look at everything together, the letters, the journeys, the struggles, the relationships, the endings, you begin to realize that this is not just a historical account. It is a framework, a way of understanding how to navigate your own path with more intention, more awareness, and more patience. And one of the most practical takeaways from all of it is that consistency matters more than intensity, because intensity can carry you for a short time, but consistency is what carries you over the long distance, and that is exactly what you see demonstrated again and again, not bursts of effort followed by silence, but steady movement forward, even when progress feels slow, even when results are not immediate. And that kind of consistency builds something that does not collapse under pressure, and that leads to one final realization that ties everything together. That the impact of a life is not always measured in the moment it is lived, often it is measured in what continues after it, in what remains, in what continues to influence people long after the original circumstances have passed. And that is exactly what these letters represent. Not just words written in a specific time and place, but something that continues to carry meaning, continues to guide, continues to challenge and encourage. And that is what makes the entire story feel alive even now. Because it is not locked in the past, it connects directly to the present. To the decisions you are making, to the challenges you are facing, to the direction you are trying to move in. And when you see it that way, it stops being just something you read and becomes something you apply, something that shapes how you think, how you act, how you respond, and ultimately how you move forward. And that is where everything lands, not in a perfect conclusion, but in a clear direction to keep going, to stay grounded, to build with intention, and to trust that what you are doing now, even if it feels small, even if it feels unseen, is part of something that can carry far more weight than you realize, as long as you remain consistent, aligned, and willing to continue forward. And when you reach this point, when you've followed the story all the way through and allowed each layer to settle, instead of rushing to the end, you begin to realize that what you've been looking at this entire time is not just the journey of one man, but a mirror that quietly reflects something back to you. Because the same patterns, the same tensions, the same questions about direction, purpose, endurance, and meaning are not locked in the past, they are present right now. And that is what gives this story its weight, not just what happened, but what it continues to reveal. And one of the clearest things it reveals is that most people underestimate the long-term impact of small, consistent decisions, because we tend to look for moments that feel big, dramatic, and immediately meaningful. But when you step back and look at the full arc, you see that it was not one single moment that defined everything. It was the accumulation of choices made day after day, often in situations that did not feel significant at the time. And that shifts the way you think about your own actions. Because it means that what you do today, even if it feels small, is part of something that is being built over time. And that leads into another realization that is easy to overlook. That direction matters more than speed, because there were moments in Paul's life where progress seemed slow, where plans were interrupted, where movement was restricted, and yet the direction never changed, and that consistency in direction is what allowed everything else to align over time. And that challenges the pressure to move quickly, to see immediate results, to constantly measure progress by visible outcomes. Because sometimes the most important thing is not how fast you are moving, but whether you are moving in the right direction at all. And once that becomes clear, it starts to change the way you respond to delays, because delays no longer automatically feel like failure. They become part of the process, part of the shaping, part of what ensures that when something does move forward, it is built on something solid. Oh, and another pattern that becomes impossible to ignore is the role of responsibility, because as the story progresses, the weight of responsibility increases, not decreases. And yet that increase is not treated as a burden to avoid, but as something to grow into. And that is an important distinction, because responsibility often feels heavy when you first encounter it, but over time, as you develop the capacity to carry it, it becomes something that gives structure and meaning rather than something that restricts you, and that is exactly what you see in the later letters, where the focus shifts more toward guiding others, toward building systems that will continue beyond one person, and that introduces the idea that real impact is not just about what you do personally, but about what continues after you, about what you leave behind in others, in structures, in ideas that can carry forward without you, and that perspective changes how you define success. Because success is no longer just about personal achievement. It becomes about contribution, about influence that extends beyond your own lifetime. And that is a much deeper and more lasting way to measure what you are doing. And then there is the way setbacks are handled. Because setbacks appear repeatedly throughout the story, not as rare exceptions, but as expected parts of the journey. And yet they are never treated as endpoints. They are treated as interruptions that require adjustment, not abandonment. And that mindset is critical, because without it, every setback feels final. Every obstacle feels like a signal to stop. But when you see setbacks as part of the process, you begin to respond differently. You begin to adapt instead of withdraw. You begin to learn instead of quit. And that ability to adapt is one of the strongest indicators of long-term endurance, because it allows you to continue moving forward, even when conditions change. And as you move toward the final perspective, one of the most powerful realizations is that clarity often comes after action, not before it, because throughout the story, there are moments where the full picture is not visible, where the outcome is uncertain, and yet action still takes place. And it is through that action that clarity begins to form, step by step, and that challenges the tendency to wait for perfect understanding before moving, because perfect understanding rarely comes in advance. It develops through engagement, through experience, through actually stepping into the situation and allowing it to unfold. And that leads to a final shift in perspective that ties everything together. The understanding that your life is not defined by isolated moments, but by the overall direction and consistency of your actions over time, and that is both challenging and encouraging, because it means that mistakes, delays, and imperfect moments do not define the entire story. But it also means that consistency, discipline, and intentional choices have a compounding effect that is far greater than they appear in the moment. And when you combine all of these insights, the patterns of persistence, direction, responsibility, adaptation, and consistency, you are left with something that feels less like a distant narrative and more like a practical framework for how to move forward in your own life, not with unrealistic expectations of perfection, but with a grounded understanding of what actually leads to lasting impact. And that is where everything ultimately lands, in a place that is both simple and demanding at the same time, to keep moving forward even when progress feels slow, to stay aligned even when distractions appear, to carry responsibility with intention, to adapt when challenges arise, and to trust that over time, those consistent actions will build something that lasts, something that matters, something that extends beyond what you can currently see. And that is what gives the entire journey its meaning. Not just the destination, but the way it is lived, step by step, choice by choice, until the story reaches its natural conclusion, not defined by perfection, but by faithfulness carried through to the end. The city is loud, restless, and endlessly moving, but somewhere inside a dim, rented space in Rome, a man sits chained to a soldier, the weight of iron pressing into his wrist as he reaches for a pen. He is not thinking about writing something that will last for centuries. He is not imagining scholars studying his words or preachers quoting his sentences. He is thinking about people, faces, names, stories, people he laughed with, prayed with, cried with. People who are now scattered across cities he may never see again. And so he begins to write, not as a philosopher building a system, but as a father speaking to his children, trying to steady them before the world pulls them apart. What he writes are letters, deeply personal, often urgent, sometimes painful, sometimes overflowing with hope. They are carried by hand, passed from one traveler to another, crossing dusty roads and open seas, moving through the veins of the Roman Empire until they reach their destinations. No printing press, no copies made instantly, just fragile sheets of papyrus and the determination of those who believed the message mattered enough to carry it forward. And somehow, those letters survive, Not just survive, but rise to become the most influential collection of correspondence the world has ever seen. 13 letters. That is what we have. 13 pieces of a life poured out over roughly 15 years. But when you open your Bible, you don't see them as a story. You see them arranged by size, longest to shortest, as if length tells you anything about the weight of a moment. Romans comes first, not because it was written first, but because it is long. Philemon comes last, not because it is least important, but because it is short. And in that arrangement, something gets lost. The movement. The progression. The way a life unfolds under pressure. Because when you put them back in the order they were actually written, something changes. Suddenly, you are not just reading theology. You are watching a life in motion. You see a man at the beginning, still raw, still burning, still fighting to protect something fragile. You see him in the middle, carrying the weight of communities that are falling apart faster than he can repair them. You see him at the end, worn down, abandoned by some, yet still holding on to the same truth he started with. And what emerges is not just a set of teachings. It is a story of endurance. The first letter comes out of fire, not comfort, not reflection, but fire. Galatians. Written early around AD 48 or 49, not long after his first missionary journey. And to understand why it feels so intense, you have to remember who is writing it. This is not a man who casually picked up religion. This is a man who once hunted believers, who stood by while Stephen was executed, who believed he was serving God by destroying the very message he now defends. His past is not a footnote. It is the backdrop to everything he writes. He had just traveled through Galatia, moving from city to city, preaching, persuading, building something out of nothing. In places like Lystra, he was attacked so violently that people thought he was dead. They dragged his body outside the city and left him there. And yet he got up. He kept going. He planted communities, left leaders behind, and returned home believing the foundation had been laid. Then the news reached him. Other teachers had followed him, stepping into those young churches and telling new believers that what Paul had taught them was incomplete. That faith in Christ was not enough, that they needed to add something. Rituals, requirements, conditions. That grace needed to be supplemented with performance. And something in Paul refuses to accept that. Not because of pride, but because he understands what is at stake. If grace is not enough, then no one is safe. If salvation can be earned, then it can also be lost. And so he writes, not gently, not carefully, but urgently. There is no long greeting, no soft introduction. He goes straight to the point because the situation demands it. What you feel in Galatians is not anger for the sake of anger. It is protection. It is a man who nearly died bringing a message now watching it be distorted, and so he draws a line. Not slightly, not vaguely, but clearly. You are not made right with God by what you do. You are made right by what Christ has done. That is the center. That is the line he will not allow anyone to move. From there, the story shifts. The fire of Galatia gives way to something softer, more pastoral. Thessalonica, a city in Greece alive with trade and movement, where Paul spent only a short time before being forced to leave under pressure. The believers there were new, barely grounded, trying to hold on to something they were still learning to understand. From a distance, Paul worries about them. He sends Timothy to check on them, to see if they are still standing. And when Timothy returns with good news, you can almost feel the relief in Paul's words. 1 Thessalonians is warm, full of affection, full of gratitude. It is the voice of someone who expected the worst and was met with something better. But even in that warmth, there is confusion among the believers. People have died, and those left behind are afraid. Not just grieving, but afraid that those who died will miss out on what is coming. That somehow they have been left behind in a way that cannot be fixed. Paul answers not with abstract ideas, but with reassurance. The dead are not forgotten, they are not second. If anything, they are first. And suddenly, hope is restored, not by removing grief, but by placing it in a larger story. But then, almost immediately, another problem emerges. Some take this hope and stretch it too far. They stop working. They stop living responsibly. They begin to wait passively, as if expecting everything to end at any moment. And Paul has to correct that too. Because hope is not meant to paralyze you. It is meant to give your actions meaning. From there, the story moves into chaos. Corinth. If Galatia was a battle over truth and Thessalonica was a moment of encouragement, Corinth is something else entirely. It is a church falling apart from the inside. Division, pride, conflict, Moral confusion. It is not one issue. It is everything at once. Paul had spent significant time there, building relationships, teaching, working alongside them. And now, from a distance, he hears report after report of things unraveling, people choosing sides, people taking each other to court, situations that go beyond misunderstanding into something deeper. 1 Corinthians reads like someone trying to hold together something that keeps breaking apart. Every chapter addresses a different issue. Every paragraph feels like another attempt to bring clarity into confusion. But right in the middle of all that correction, Paul pauses. And he writes about love, not as a side note, not as decoration, but as the center. Because without it, everything else collapses. You can have knowledge, you can have faith, you can even have sacrifice. But without love, it all becomes noise, empty, loud, but meaningless. And then he builds towards something even bigger, the resurrection, not as an optional belief, but as the foundation. If Christ is not raised, then everything else falls apart. But if he is, then everything changes. Not just in theory, but in reality. 2 Corinthians feels different. The tone shifts. There is more vulnerability. Something has happened between the two letters, something painful. Paul has been hurt, challenged, questioned, and instead of defending himself with strength, he does something unexpected. He talks about weakness, not as failure, but as the place where something deeper is revealed. He lists his struggles, not to gain sympathy, but to show what it means to continue anyway. And then he shares something personal, something unresolved. A burden he asked God to remove, and the answer he received was not removal, but strength to endure. And in that, something shifts again. Because now the story is not just about what Paul is building, but about what is being built in him. And from there, everything moves towards something larger, something more complete, something that will bring all of these threads together into one final, powerful expression of the message he has been carrying from the beginning.